So this was an interesting post that I came across talking about how you can make a Mageblood at home. It takes advantage of the new Nature's Concoction passive from the Warden of the Magi Ascendancy, and what it basically allows you to do is perma-sustain a single flask while scaling flask effect from upwards of 120%. The way this is done is by combining the Micro-Distillery belt, Nature's Boon from the Pathfinder Ascendancy, Natural Remedies, and 20% flask effect from the smaller Pathfinder passives. Excluding any other flask modifiers that you could roll on the belt or obtain from other passives, this is what will allow you to gain 120% increased flask effect, assuming you're attacking enemies with your weapon. Taking a closer look at the new Nature's Concoction passive, it allows you to gain 3 charges per hit on an enemy every second, and this is what allows you to perma-sustain any flask that is adjacent to a tincture. The reason that we want the tincture in the 5th slot is because the downside of using the Micro-Distillery belt does not affect tinctures. So the typical setup you'll see with this combination will likely be 4 flasks followed by a tincture in the 5th slot. Depending on the attack speed of the build, it's possible to run 2 tinctures in order to sustain 3 flasks instead of 1, but the main drawback of this setup would require the user to constantly swap the application between the 2 tinctures. It's also possible to do a setup where 2 flasks are sustained by a single tincture in the 2nd or 3rd slot, but this would require the 5th slot to be empty due to the belt. So in all likelihood, I'd imagine that most people trying out the new passive with the Micro-Distillery belt will be running 4 flasks with the tincture in the 5th slot. Now the original poster mentions that running a silver flask is probably what he'll do in this case, since it has such great synergy with attack-based builds. Onslaught alone increases movement speed, attack speed, and cast speed by 20%, and if we were to scale this effect by 120%, you'll find that you could achieve a 44% increase from this buff instead, at virtually 100% uptime. There was also another comment that suggested using Taste of Hate in the 4th slot, which if we scaled this by 120%, you'll find that players could convert up to an additional 33% physical damage taken as elemental damage from a single flask. Combine that with 50% from Lightning Coil and another 15% from helmet modifiers, and you could get pretty darn close to 100% physical damage taken as elemental. Another option for the 4th slot would be running Divination Distillate. Although this would require Pathfinders to run Master Surgeon in order for its effects to remain at full life, scaling all of its effects with 90% increased flask effect will give a permanent 57% increased item rarity, 23% increased item quantity, and 95% to all elemental resistances. Something to keep in mind when using this setup is that Nature's Boon only applies to magic flasks, which is why I calculated only a 90% increased flask effect in this case. Although some players might be considering the option of running a gold flask in the 4th slot, even with a 120% flask effect applied, this will only grant a flat 66% increased item rarity from the gold flask, which is far worse than 57% rarity and 23% quantity from Divination Distillate. Now taking a look at some unique bismuth flasks, we first have the Wise Oak, which could offer up to 11% reduced elemental damage taken and 15% elemental damage penetration. And if we were to run Oriath's End instead, you could get up to a 57% chance to explode enemies killed during the flask effect. And as we discussed, this effect would basically be permanent. On top of that, these flasks will grant an additional 66% to all elemental resistances while in the 4th slot. Another interesting option to consider is running Coralito's Signature. This flask alone could provide your character with 190% increased crit chance, 47% chance to poison on hits, and 57% damage over time multiplier. However, the downside of running this flask is that you'll also have to deal with the flat chaos damage over time degen. Now if a player were to choose Bottled Faith in this 4th slot, they could stand to gain a permanent 19% increased damage taken by enemies, on top of a 285% increased crit chance against enemies on the consecrated ground.